I think it's pretty fair to say that most people have heard of this game these days. To my understanding, when Psychonauts first came out, it didn't sell all that well, but instead it grew its own cult following. I mean, that's how I heard about the game, from people who really enjoyed it and considered it to be a hidden gem. After all, it's developed by Double Fine, which was founded by Tim Schafer and consisted of a few other ex-LucasArts developers, most of who had worked on point-and-click adventure games, and had left LucasArts because LucasArts wasn't focusing on those style games anymore. I mean, Tim Schafer's own history proved to be some interest, with games like Grim Fandango and The Day of the Tentacle under his belt, all being games full of personality, but again are also point-and-click adventures. This team doesn't really have a whole hell of a lot of experience when it comes to 3D platformers, which is precisely what Psychonauts is supposed to be, which to me kinda begs the question of just how well did they do at making this 3D platformer? Is Psychonauts really that great of a hidden gem? Well, here's kinda what I got out of it. So, in a world where psychic powers exist, there is a summer camp where these counselors are trying to teach and train young children how to use their powers. One night, while being lectured by Coach Oleander, our hero emerges. Meet the young boy Raz, a kid with a lot of potential and psychic powers, who fled the circus to become a psychonaut, which is basically a psychic spy. And from there, the story just follows Raz while he learns how to use his psychic powers at this camp. However, at a certain point in the game, things change drastically. I won't spoil what happens, but let's just say Raz has to go to an abandoned asylum in order to save the children of the camp. So the asylum area is cool, and you meet some interesting characters there. However, I hate this shift the story takes at this point. Okay, yeah, I changed my mind. I'm gonna spoil the turn, so skip ahead if you want to. Ready? Here we go. It turns out that Oleander was stealing the brains of the children to power a psychic tank. Now, if that sounds a bit stupid to you, well, guess what? I agree. And the reason for this is because prior to that change, the story was going in a very different direction that had a lot of potential to it, rather than being this rather generic and simplistic one. You see, early on, you're getting more familiar with these kids, where you can see that these psychic powers are having an effect on their psyche. Tensions start to rise with some of the children, others act really creepy, and you're just kind of waiting to see these kids act out more as the adults start to lose their control of them, which to me sounds so much more interesting. But no, instead it just becomes a very generic villain with an evil plan in the end. I should say that I do like these characters a lot. Raz is a fine lead, as he really does enjoy the idea of improving his psychic powers, and he knows he's gifted but doesn't brag about it. Some of the kids really stand out, like Duggan, Lily, and Clement Crystal. The adults at the camp and the asylum are interesting too, since in the game you can learn more about their backstory and what kind of issues they face internally, which helps gives them more depth. So to sum up my thoughts, I think the story starts off very strong. Just at a certain point it becomes really generic and loses a lot of the strength that the early parts had. But it does make up for this with the characters, as there's plenty of good and interesting characters that at least help keep my interest throughout the story. Okay, so Psychonauts is a 3D platformer and a bit of a collectathon. I'm kinda cheating by having this game in the marathon because you don't need to collect certain items all the time to progress, but you will be collecting objects constantly. Let's just get some of the main aspects out of the way here. There are two kind of hub areas. First off, we have the camp, and later you have the asylum, though the asylum also acts as a bit of a level 2. Now, there isn't too much to do in the campsite, as at first you can find some of the other campers and talk to them, but later on they all end up disappearing, which for me was a bit disappointing. At the very least, you can find these arrowheads lying around, and they are basically this game's currency, and can be used to buy items at the main lodge. Many of the items you collect contribute to Raz's rank, such as PSI cards, PSI markers, scavenger hunt items, and when in people's minds, you can collect these 2D images called figments. Increasing Raz's rank will help improve his psychic abilities, as well as certain ranks being needed to let him purchase certain items items at the lodge. Now, one of the two main aspects of the game involves jumping into people's minds, which act as these large platforming levels. Thankfully, there is a lot of variety to these levels, and not just in terms of the visuals. Some of the levels are more linear and focus on platforming. A few are more open and revolve around certain psychic powers. There is a level where you help out this man who's playing a strategy game against his ancestor, though admittedly I do see why some people find this to be a bit more annoying since it does get pretty tedious going back and forth between talking to the guy and playing the strategy game itself. There's one where you help out this woman to properly complete her play, and even a level that takes place in a lungfish head where you can run around as a large monster. Again, this really helps make each level stand out, as well as making you excited to play the next level to see how they will change things up this time around. However, without getting into spoilers, the final level is by far the worst part of this game, as it will leave you extremely frustrated. Unfortunately, it kinda highlights the platforming and controls in a worser light with how the level is set up. On top of that, it does have an escort mission section that's pretty tedious and kind of annoying. It also doesn't help that the controls aren't that great in this game. Roz has some very clunky movement with his basic attacks feeling very stiff. On top of that, the hitboxes of their characters and objects feels off. Like trying to properly land on certain platforms or trying to navigate certain areas can be frustrating because you don't know what you can properly land on and what you can't. And again, fighting enemies with these questionable hitboxes makes it seem like you're able to hit an enemy when you're actually not, as enemies will hit you while you're mid-combo. It's not the worst thing ever, but in all honesty, the platforming isn't as smooth as other games on the same system. I can deal with this, but this game would play a lot better if the controls in combat had a little extra attention given to them. But to be fair to the game, there are some nice layouts for the platforming, like swinging from one section to another, that also incorporate some of your psychic powers that create really unique scenarios, because they really do flex the strengths of the game's creativity, which is nice. Within these levels, you can collect a few extra objects, like these emotional baggages, where you first have to find their tag to get them out of the level, and these supposedly give you access to Primal Memories when you've removed all the bags. I say supposedly because I can't really remember removing all of them from one level, or if I even found a Primal Memory. There are mental cobwebs that you can suck up with certain items to be used to increase your rank, and most interesting of all are these memories. Memories are these living vaults that when hit will give you a slideshow of a memory to the person whose world you're in. I really like these for storytelling purposes, and the slideshow has this charming art style to them, so I actually find them fun to look for and collect. Lastly, we have the psychic powers Roz will learn as you progress through the game, and these will be needed to not only fight off enemies, but to also interact with objects or get past certain areas in some of the levels. These psychic powers will range from invisibility to sneak past goons, telekinesis to move and throw objects, pyrokinesis to set things on fire, clairvoyance to see through other people's eyes, confusion to cause the enemies to attack one another, shield to protect you from attacks, marksmanship to shoot a mind laser at enemies, and lastly we have levitation, which generates this orb that makes Roz move much faster and can help him clear large gaps. This ability is by far my favorite, and the psychic power I found myself using the most. Some of these powers you will only need to use like once to get past certain sections, like clairvoyance, but most of the psychic abilities are useful throughout the game, like levitation, shield, and marksmanship, though telekinesis and pyrokinesis can be a little awkward to use. And finally, within the levels, you can find these strange worm creatures who will let you teleport throughout the level, which is a great feature, especially if you're trying to collect all the objects in the level and need to do some backtracking. Speaking of which, the progression of the game is, for the most part, pretty linear. You really don't have to go out of your way to collect too many objects to progress. Instead, it's more like you go from one person to the next, pretty much with the counselors who help teach you your abilities for the first part of the game. There were only like a couple times that I found myself a little confused about where you needed to go next, but I think that was because I wasn't paying enough attention. It's thankfully not too long of a game, only lasting about 10 to 15 hours, which isn't too bad for a 3D platformer. I personally don't ever feel like going out of the way to collect everything, simply because of just how much there is to collect, and I don't really feel like increasing my rank made that much of a difference except for when it was necessary to get certain items at the lodge. Again, the game's progression is fine, I just personally didn't find myself getting all that engaged with the game, and kinda would've preferred if the campsite was the only hub area. I think it would've made level navigation a little bit easier, though thankfully there is this other psychic realm you'll eventually get access to that gives you these doorways to everyone's mind in one section, at least the minds you visited, which is nice. So visually, the game is a mixed bag for me. On one hand, I really like the bizarre art style here. Characters all have unique designs, there are some interesting enemies you'll encounter, and the campsite is a pretty inviting looking place. While on the other hand, some of the characters look awful. The texture work ends up making certain areas look really muddy, and the animations are super stiff and awkward. This all could just apply to the PlayStation 2 version, as I haven't played the others, so take that with a grain of salt. This art style can really shine when in certain worlds like Mia's Dance Party, Milkman Conspiracy, and especially Black Velvetopia. Voice acting in the game is pretty good. Everyone does a nice job of making their characters feel alive, which shouldn't be too surprising considering the cast, with voice actors like Steve Bloom, Tara Strong, and of course Richard Steven as Roz. I will forever love Views him. The music is fine. Most of it is more atmospheric and really doesn't stand out all that much. I don't want to treat that too much as a negative, but I'll be completely honest here, I do find the soundtrack to be rather forgettable. So yeah, I like this game, and I think it has some great ideas and some fun moments, but boy do I also have some issues at the same time. I'm not a fan of how the story changes later on in the game. Controls are kinda stiff and awkward. The way the game progresses just didn't feel all that smooth, like something was off. I just couldn't get into the game as well, and that final level sucks so fucking much. But the early parts of the story are great. Using psychic powers in a platformer is cool, and results in some unique and even well-constructed platforming segments. And some of the worlds you visit are really imaginative and fun. I personally wouldn't say that Psychonauts is a great game, as it's just a little too rough around the edges for my liking. That's not to say I think it's bad, just decent. I have a hard time recommending this one. I say it's worth playing if you enjoy 3D platformers and want to give something a bit different a try. See, I don't regret playing the game, but at the same time, I don't feel like ever playing it again. Who knows, maybe the upcoming sequel will do better, and I certainly hope so. But as for Psychonauts itself, it's just okay. Don't go into this game with too high of expectations. This is a game I wanted to love, but came out feeling mixed on. Next time, we'll talk about a little 3D platformer that takes place in a jungle.